Hi guys, welcome to your lesson on 5.3 and 5.4. And we're going to start off with talking about long-term memory and capacity of our long-term memory. So our capacity for storing long-term memories is essentially limitless. One research team, after studying the brain's neural connections, estimated its storage capacity as in the same ballpark as the World Wide Web, which is really incredible. Where's long-term memory stored? So this lesson, we're really going to be relooping or relearning a lot of terms from Unit 2 on biology, which is awesome. So psychologist Carl Lashley in 1950 trained rats to find their way out of a maze, then surgically removed pieces of their brain's cortex and retested their memory. No matter which small brain section he removed, the rats retained at least a partial memory of how to navigate the maze. Memories are brain-based, but the brain distributes the components of a memory across a network of locations, which is awesome. What role do the frontal lobes play in processing explicit memories? So remember that in the last lesson, explicit memory is retention of facts and experiences in the long-term memory that one can consciously know and declare. They were also called declarative memories. Explicit memories can either be semantic, which are facts and general knowledge, such as George Washington was our first president, or episodic, experienced events, such as I had a clown at my 6th birthday party. What role do the frontal lobes play in semantic and episodic memory? So semantic memory is recalling a password and holding it in working memory. For example, that would activate the left frontal lobe. Calling up a visual party scene would more likely activate the right frontal lobe. So we're dealing with holding something in your working memory versus visualizing something. So that's different lobes that you're depending on for those two things. The hippocampus, as you know, is responsible for memory, but it's much deeper than that. So we talked about a way to remember that is hippo. You would remember it if there was a hippo on campus, right? That is an easy way to remember hippocampus in memory. Well, explicit memories for facts and episodes are processed in the hippocampus. Those in the diagram to the right are those little orange slices. And then they're fed to other regions for storage. So the hippocampus is a subcortical limbic system structure in the temporal lobe. So processed in the hippocampus and then fed to other brain regions for storage. So cognitive neuroscientists have found that the hippocampus, which is a temporal lobe neural center located in the limbic system, can be likened to a save button for explicit memories. Brain scans reveal activity in the hippocampus and nearby brain networks as people form explicit memories of names, images, and events. What does the research show about the subregions of the hippocampus? One subregion is active as people and mice learn social information. Part of the hippocampus is active as memory champions engage in spatial mnemonics. And the rear hippocampal region, which processes spatial memory, grows bigger as London cabbies, meaning cab drivers, navigate the city's complicated maze of streets. So the hippocampus itself is like a giant save button, but then there's different purposes for the different subregions of the hippocampus itself. What is memory consolidation? So memories are not permanently stored in the hippocampus. Instead, it seems to act as kind of a loading dock where the brain registers and temporarily holds the elements of a to-be remembered episode, its smell, feel, sound, location. Then, like older files shifted to a basement storeroom, the memories migrate for storage elsewhere. This process is called memory consolidation. And it makes sense. You're consolidating your memories. They're not all being held in the hippocampus. How does sleep aid memory consolidation? Well, during deep sleep, the hippocampus processes memories for later retrieval. Researchers have watched the hippocampus and brain cortex displaying simultaneous activity rhythms during sleep as if talking. And the brain may be replaying the day's experiences as it transfers them to the cortex for long-term storage. So remember the different types of dreams. One of them was the synthesis, where you're synthesizing your day, activation synthesis, remember that? So replaying your day's experiences and trying to make sense of it. Well, your brain may do that when you're sleeping. So when our learning is distributed over days rather than crammed into a single day, we experience more sleep-induced memory consolidation, and that helps explain the spacing effect. So given time to consolidate new learning over many sleep cycles makes recall easier, which is why we're constantly telling you, don't cram, which is why I give you many days and chunk up your study guide and chunk up the cycle blurbs, because your brain processes it much better in little chunks compared to cramming it all into one little chunk of time. Also, when you space it out, the likelihood that you remember it later or in the long term is much greater than if you cram. When you cram to learn, you're learning it for 90 minutes and then you walk out of here and you forget it. That in a class like this does not help you at all. So how are implicit memories processed? Your hippocampus and frontal lobes are processing sites for your explicit memories, but you could lose those areas and still, thanks to automatic processing, lay down implicit memories for skills and newly conditioned associations. So let's consider a story. A brain damaged patient had amnesia, which left her unable to recognize her physician as, each day, he shook her hand and introduced himself. One day, she yanked her hand back, for the physician had pricked her with a tack in his palm. The next time he returned to introduce himself, she refused to shake his hand, but couldn't explain why. Having been classically conditioned, she just wouldn't do it. Having an implicit long-term memory, she felt what she could not explain. Pretty cool. So the cerebellum, the little brain at the rear of the brainstem. Functions include processing sensory input, coordinating movement, output and balance, and enabling nonverbal learning and memory. The cerebellum plays a key role in forming and storing the implicit memories created by classical conditioning. With a damaged cerebellum, people cannot develop certain conditioned reflexes, such as associating a tone with an impending puff of air, and thus do not blink in anticipation of the puff. What role do the basal ganglia play in memory formation? The basal ganglia, deep brain structures involved in motor movement, facilitate formation of our procedural memories, or non-declarative or implicit for skills. The basal ganglia receive input from the cortex, but do not return the favor of sending information back to the cortex for conscious awareness of procedural learning. So we're talking about basal ganglia and procedural memories only. All right, what is infantile amnesia? As adults, our conscious memory of our first 4 years is largely blank. That is an experience called infantile amnesia. Think about it for a second. What's your first memory? What's something you can totally remember? In one study, events that children experienced and discussed with their mothers at age 3 were 60% remembered at age 7, but only 34% remembered at age 9. 2 influences that contribute to infantile amnesia. First, we index much of our explicit memory with a command of language that young children don't possess. Second, the hippocampus is one of the last brain structures to mature, and as it does, more gets retained. Makes sense. As your brain matures, which again doesn't fully finish forming until 24 years old. The amygdala, revisiting the amygdala, 2 little lima bean-sized neural clusters in the limbic system and linked to emotion. What role does it play in memory processing? Well, stress hormones focus memory. Stress provokes the amygdala to initiate a memory trace that boosts activity in the brain's memory-forming areas. So it's as if the amygdala says, brain, encode this moment for future reference. The result? Emotional arousal can sear certain events into the brain while disrupting memory for irrelevant events. In other words, remembering things that were emotional or important to remember versus things that didn't really have any meaning or purpose. How do emotions affect our memory processing? Emotional events produce tunnel vision memory. They focus our attention and recall on high priority information and reduce our recall of irrelevant details. Whatever rivets our attention gets well recalled at the expense of the surrounding context. A flashbulb memory is a clear, sustained, long-term memory of an emotionally significant moment or event. For instance, those born in the 40s and 50s can usually remember exactly where they were when President Kennedy was shot. Those who experienced the explosion of the Challenger space shuttle in January of 1986 can typically recall exactly where they were. I was 6 years old and I was at my grandparents' house. I remember exactly where I was sitting on the couch. I remember watching it on the television, and I remember not knowing what to think. I remember how I felt. It was crazy. And sadly, many Americans can recount precisely where they were and what they were doing on the morning of September 11th. I also, crystal clear, remember what I was doing. I woke up at my roommate's. I had some roommates and we watched the news, and it was all over the news. And then I drove to work, and I remember just feeling super scared driving to work, and it was so sad. So flashbulb memories are those memories that are clear, sustained, long-term memory tied to something emotionally significant or an event. All right, how can a sea slug help us understand memory? The aplysia, the California sea slug, which neuroscientist Eric Kandel studied for 45 years, has increased our understanding of the neural basis of learning and memory. How does serotonin release at the synapse impact memory processing? So Kandel and James Schwartz observed synaptic changes during learning in the neurons of the aplysia. When learning occurs, the slug releases more of the neurotransmitter serotonin into certain neurons. These cells' synapses then become more efficient at transmitting signals. Experience and learning can increase, even double, the number of synapses, even in slugs. So when you're learning, you're forming new synapses, which is so incredible. You are strengthening your brain, just like if you went running to strengthen your muscles. So how does Kandel's research impact human memory processes? Well, in experiments with people, rapidly stimulating certain memory circuit connections has increased their sensitivity for hours or even weeks to come. The sending neuron now needs less prompting to release its neurotransmitter, and more connections exist between neurons. This increased efficiency of potential neural firing, called long-term potentiation, so think action potential, that's what we're relating it to, but now we're going to talk about long-term potentiation, provides a neural basis for learning and remembering associations. So long-term potentiation is an increase in a cell's firing potential after brief rapid stimulation, a neural basis for learning and memory. How does LTP impact receptor sites? Well, an electron microscope image, which is on the left side, image A, shows just one receptor site, which is gray, reaching toward a sending neuron before long-term potentiation. Image B shows that after LTP, the receptor sites have doubled, which is incredible. You want to form more synapses. That means your brain is strengthening and that you're growing and that you're learning. So what research confirms LTP as a physical basis for memory? Well, drugs that block LTP interfere with learning. Drugs that mimic what happens during learning increase LTP. And rats given a drug that enhanced LTP learned a maze with half the usual number of mistakes. How do cues help with memory retrieval? So when you encode into memory a target piece of information, such as the name of the person sitting next to you in class, you associate it with other bits of information about your surroundings, such as mood, seating, position, and so on. These bits can serve as retrieval cues that you can later use to access the information. The more retrieval cues you have, the better your chances of finding a route to the suspended memory. What are the best retrieval cues? Well, the best retrieval cues come from associations we form at the time we encode a memory. Smells, tastes, and sights that can evoke our memory of the associated person or event. To call up visual cues when trying to recall something, we may mentally place ourselves in the original context. What's priming? So priming is the activation, often unconsciously, of particular associations in long-term implicit memory. So difference between perceptual set and priming. A tendency to perceive or notice some aspects of the available sensory data and ignore others. This was a review from Unit 3. And priming is the implicit memory effect in which exposure to a stimulus influences response to a later stimulus. How does priming work? Well, after seeing or hearing the word rabbit, we're more likely to spell the spoken word hair, H-A-I-R, as H-A-R-E, even if we don't recall seeing or hearing rabbit. That activated the concept, therefore we're going to now all of a sudden go to the rabbit version of hair. So an example, if walking down a hallway you see a poster of a missing child, you may then unconsciously be primed to interpret an ambiguous adult-child interaction as a possible kidnapping. Although you no longer have the poster in mind, it predisposes your interpretation. Implicit memory of the poster impacts your later response to the situation. What is context-dependent memory? Putting yourself back in the context where you earlier experienced something can prime your memory retrieval. Remembering in many ways depends on our environment. When you visit your childhood home or neighborhood, old memories surface. How does context enable recall? Well, when scuba divers listen to a word list in 2 different settings, either 10 feet underwater or sitting on the beach, they recalled more words if tested in the same place. What is the encoding specificity principle? The idea that cues and contexts specific to a particular memory will be most effective in helping us to recall it. What is state-dependent memory? What we learn in one physiological state, be it drunk or sober, may be more easily recalled when we are in that exact state again. What people learn when drunk, they don't recall well in any state. Alcohol disrupts memory storage, but they recall it slightly better again when they're drunk. If you study while on the treadmill, increasing your heart rate, you will likely have better recall of the material when your heart rate is accelerated again. That's another example that's healthy. What is mood congruent theory? So, the tendency to recall experiences that are consistent with one's current good or bad mood or emotional state. I love this cartoon. I can't remember what we're arguing about either. Let's keep yelling and maybe it'll come back to us. Have you ever been in like, not an argument, but maybe like a dispute or disagreement where after a while you're like, what are we even arguing about? What are we even talking about? How does mood congruency impact the duration of our moods? Well, mood effects on retrieval help explain why our moods persist. When happy, we recall happy events and therefore see the world as a happy place, which helps prolong our good mood. But when we're depressed, we recall sad events, which darkens our interpretation of current events. For those of us predisposed to depression, this process can help maintain a vicious dark cycle. This slide is one of my favorites in this whole lesson because it really helps us understand why we act and how we feel when we're in certain moods. It's so cool. All right, what's the serial position effect? So our tendency to recall best the last and first items in a list. That's the recency effect and the primacy effect. Research Show about the serial position effect. Well, in experiments, when people viewed a list of items, words, names, dates, even experienced odors, and immediately tried to recall them in any order, they fell prey to the serial position effect. Why does the serial position effect influence memory retrieval? This is our last slide. Subjects briefly recalled the last items especially quickly and well, a recency effect, perhaps because those last items were still in the working memory. Recall that echoic information remains in the sensory memory for about 4 seconds. But after a delay, when their attention was elsewhere, their recall was best for the first items, primacy effect. This is likely due to enhanced rehearsal of the first items. Awesome. So this lesson has concluded. We will do some mini experiments as a part of our lesson check-in in class. And please jot down any questions that you have to make sure that when we do our check-in, you get all of your questions answered. Have a great day. Bye.